The farmer's son drove his body onto the sword. It happened in the space of a single breath. Henderson wrapped his arms around the six-star knight's blade and held it still, and the steel came out through his back at an angle that left no room for ambiguity. He looked up at Fernando, who stood one step behind him, too stunned to move, and his expression carried a calm that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arithmetic. A farmer's calculation, what is spent against what is saved, weighed without self-pity, and closed. The numbers came out the way they came out. Fernando took the opening Henderson had bought and brought his sword down. His comrades reached Henderson before the body of the man who had killed him settled. He was still breathing. He kept trying to tell them to advance. By the time they stopped listening and lifted him, the battle was already over, and he had already won it, and somewhere behind his eyes, there may have been the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows his last contribution was his best one. He died before Roman arrived, but none of that had been written yet. Before the wars and the names carved into Dmitri stone and the armies that moved at a single man's word, there was only a room in a northeast manor, a bed with someone in it who should not have been there, and a morning so ordinary it had no idea what it was about to become. He woke without ceremony. No divine light, no voice announcing purpose. There was a ceiling he had never seen, walls that carried the faint mineral smell of iron dust and unaired rooms, and a body lying in a way bodies do after a long illness. Arse swollen, muscles atrophied, every internal system running slightly behind. He lay still for a moment and took stock. His name, in the records of this kingdom, was Roman Dmitri. He understood this the way a man understands the layout of a borrowed house, completely, but without ownership. The memories were there, the manor, the family, the reputation, the elder brother who outpaced him at everything, the father whose expressions were carefully arranged toward disappointment. He had access to all of it. None of it was his. Underneath all of it, much older and much heavier, lived what baked Jun Huk had been. He had been the heavenly demon, the absolute and final authority of the heavenly demon sect in the world of Murim, a man who had unified what no one before him could approach, who had been thrown into a survival pit as a small child by his own father, and had climbed out as something the word child no longer fit. He had fought his way to the apex of his entire world. He had held it without challenge. He had accepted death, when it came, with the genuine peace of a man who had finished everything. He had not been consulted about what came next. He sat up and examined the body with professional detachment. The legs were thin, the arms undertrained, the mana pathways, what this world called aura channels, were tangled and half-developed, like rope left in a pile for a year. There was also a chemical trace in the blood, something that had burned off but left a residue. A drug, introduced recently, and not for medicinal purposes. He noted it. Set it aside. He had started from worse beginnings. Hans arrived with a breakfast tray. He was a compact, careful man, neat at the temples, gray in the hair, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent so many years in service that the shape of his whole life has become the shape of one person's needs. He set the tray down with the precision of a man who has learned to do ordinary things very well. He looked at Roman with the expression of a man bracing for a specific kind of difficulty. He was told it was a good morning. Hans blinked. He agreed, cautiously, that it was. Roman ate. The food was plain. Bread, something salted, weak tea. He finished it steadily and without complaint, and when he was done he sat for a moment and let the room tell him things. There was a ledger on the desk with small debts never repaid, clothes pushed into a corner rather than folded, the texture of a young man who had stopped maintaining his space. He asked Hans nothing yet. He would read before he questioned. Hans remained near the door with the energy of a man who wants to be useful and has learned not to assume it is wanted. Roman found, in some quiet corner of his awareness, that he did not mind the presence. He found the note beneath the bed, in a small box that was not locked. The handwriting was unsteady. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, which meant it had been written for the act of writing rather than for any reader. It spoke about a man named Anthony Barco, about a party and a drug, about a woman named Emily Barco, and a scene that had been arranged carefully in advance. About an ultimatum delivered in private: destroy the Lawrence engagement yourself, or be exposed and absorbed into the Barco family's plans by scandal. The original Roman Dmitri had loved Flora Lawrence. He had been unable to see a path through the trap that did not cost her something: her reputation, her family's alliance, her father's judgment of her. He had looked at the options and found one remaining door and walked through it. He had been 17, or close. He had no technique, nothing in his hands that could fight back against a scheming Viscount's son who had money and low morals and the patience to plan 3 moves ahead. The trap had not required strength to set. It only required that the person inside it be weak enough to have no alternatives. The man reading the note had, in a previous life, never once been in a position where he had nothing in his hands. His father, the previous heavenly demon, had thrown him into a pit of other children at an age when most boys were still afraid of the dark, because that was how the sex leadership passed, and sentiment was a weight no apex could afford to carry. He had not been angry about this, then or since. He had understood the logic. He had become exactly what the logic was designed to produce. But this boy, this ordinary, unprotected, love-struck boy had been walked into a corner by someone with less real power and more willingness to use ugly tools, and the boy had found no door out except the one that cost only himself. Roman folded the note, replaced it under the bed. He would deal with Anthony Barco. Not today, probably not soon, but when the time was right he would deal with Anthony Barco the way certain things deserved to be dealt with, and Anthony Barco would not find it comfortable. He went to find his father. Roman Dmitri was a frontier baron whose real foundation was the forge. Blacksmith made noble, a man who had built his family's position out of iron and industry rather than connections or inheritance. He looked at Roman across his study desk with the careful expressionlessness of someone who has been surprised before and taken steps against it. He heard the request out without interruption, authority over his own affairs, the right to choose his personal soldiers. He said he would see. He said results were more honest than plans. Roman accepted this and left without argument. He had spent his entire previous existence earning acknowledgement from a harder man than this one. He understood that demonstrated truth was more durable than demanded recognition. He would not press. He would show. And once the showing was done, Romero would have no further confusion. That evening, in the training ground at the edge of the manor, he sat down and began the first bodily reform. The Danchan system, 3 energy centers in the body, carefully cultivated and connected, designed to refine and circulate power rather than store it for crude release, was the foundation of everything he had ever done. He had seen Dimitri's household knights sparring that afternoon and had watched what the continent's aura tradition produced. Men who built force in their muscles and released it all at once, like a bucket poured rather than a stream directed. Against someone who had not yet learned to do it differently, the method worked adequately. Against someone operating from a corrected version of the same principle, it was not going to hold. He worked through the night on the circulation paths, strand by strand, patient and methodical, the way someone untangles a rope with their fingers rather than pulling at it. Hans found him there at dawn, still seated, and stood for a moment with the breakfast tray before setting it down nearby without comment. It was, Roman noted distantly, a useful quality. 3 days later, the northeast streets provided a lesson in what this territory had been allowed to become. He was walking, mapping distances, reading population density, the old habit of assessing any ground he stood on, when he heard sounds in an alley. 5 men with clubs were working methodically on someone who had stopped trying to get up. A boy of about 12 stood at the alley's mouth and watched with the absolute stillness of someone who has learned that moving draws attention. His face was doing the calculation that children in his situation learn to do quickly. Nothing I do right now changes this outcome, so I watch. His father, Roman understood, a debt to the Bloodfang organization, collection in the only currency Bloodfang accepted. One of the men noticed Roman at the alley's entrance and offered, with profanity, the suggestion that he continue walking. There was a piece of broken fence in the mud at his feet, perhaps 2.5 feet of weathered wood, still solid enough. He picked it up. He turned it once in his hand. The muscle memory of evaluating a weapon before committing was older than this world, and it did not ask permission. What happened next did not last long enough to call a fight. The first man reached him with genuine speed, which was worth acknowledging. The branch caught him across the temple, and he sat down in the mud without completing his swing. The second drew a blade, and the branch redirected his momentum into the alley wall, with enough force to spare him the trouble of deciding what to do next. The remaining 3 came together, which suggested some rudimentary coordination, but insufficient experience with opponents who did not respond to pressure the expected way. Roman stepped inside the group's reach and worked from there, and by the time the last one stopped moving, the whole exchange had taken less time than it would have taken to explain why it was a bad idea. His knuckles ached. The original Roman's hands were not built for bare fist work. He noted the complaint, filed it, and crouched beside the men on the ground and told them to pass a message to their leadership. He gave his name. Then he helped the father to his feet. The man thanked him through a split lip. Roman told him it was handled, because it was, and helped him out of the alley. The boy had not moved. Roman looked at him. The boy was the kind of thin that comes from a long time without enough food rather than from growth, and his eyes were working, taking the scene apart piece by piece and putting the pieces back together in a way that produced calculations rather than feelings. He asked the boy his name. Kevin, the boy told him. He was told to go home. He went, but he stopped twice to look back before the alley corner took him out of sight, and both times the look was the same. Bloodfang's reply came the following evening, in the form of 18 men gathered in the tavern they operated openly on the east side of the territory, a building whose function was apparently common knowledge that no one in authority had found it worth addressing. Roman went there alone. Hans expressed, in the tone of a man who knows he is performing an obligation rather than achieving an effect, several consecutive concerns about this approach. Roman heard them with complete attention, acknowledged them genuinely, and left. The tavern contained perhaps 18 men. He identified the one with his back to the wall and eyes on the door before he reached the middle of the room, crossed directly to him, and introduced himself by breaking the man's hand. The next several minutes were not enjoyable for the people on the receiving end. He gathered the headquarters address from the man with the broken hand, who discovered quickly that repeating the question was not something Roman would need to do, and left the tavern in a condition that would require substantial reconstruction. Outside, under a lamp post across the road, Kevin was standing in the dark. Roman stopped. He asked how long. "Since the alley," Kevin said. "He was told to go home." Kevin said he would rather not. Roman walked back toward the manor. Kevin followed at a careful distance, far enough back to be technically not following, close enough to be visible, and stopped only when Roman turned at the gate with a look that communicated the conversation was finished for the night. Not permanently, just for the night. He told Hans to find out about the boy's situation. Hans, who had served long enough to know when a request was a decision that had already been made, wrote the name down without comment. 2 days later, Roman crossed the river into Lawrence territory without requesting permission and walked into the market square of the town where a man named Ben Miles had operated for 4 years on the assumption that no one significant would ever choose to move against him. It had been an accurate assumption until the morning it stopped being one. He found Miles at his usual table in his usual establishment. He removed him by the hair. He walked Miles through the main square this way, in full view of the market day crowd. The stall keepers, the buyers, the people who had been paying tribute to Bloodfang for years, and who now stood in a ring around what was happening, and were very quiet. He executed Miles at the center of the square. The crowd did not disperse. They stayed and looked at the young nobleman standing without particular expression over the body of a man they had feared for years. And no one said anything, because no one had the right words for what they had just watched. Lawrence's knights arrived shortly after. Their commander asked for an explanation, carefully. Roman gave one. He described Bloodfang's activities across both territories with the precision of someone who had conducted the investigation directly, named the organization's structure and operations, and suggested that the Baron might find it useful to address what remained on his side of the river now that the leadership was gone. He said it the way someone offers practical information to a colleague, without condescension and without waiting to see whether it was received well. Baron Lawrence, when the report arrived, quietly reinstated the engagement between his daughter and the Dmitri heir. He did not announce it. He sent no formal communication. He simply removed the dissolution from his records and said nothing further, which in the language of frontier nobles was a form of acknowledgement. Flora Lawrence arrived the following week. She had arranged herself carefully for the meeting, polished, composed, with the bearing of a young woman whose family had invested in her education and who had learned to use every social tool available to her. She had come prepared with low expectations and a clean exit strategy. She was not prepared to encounter someone who had already read her position better than she had, and who opened the conversation by handing her exactly the exit she had planned to engineer for herself. He told her, before she could arrange the room, that the engagement should end. He said it plainly. He cited his own unsuitability. He offered to take the public blame in its entirety, so that her reputation remained intact and her future prospects unaffected. He framed it so that the dignity in the outcome was entirely hers. She agreed. She left with the dissolution handled and her family standing untouched, and somewhere on the road back to Lawrence territory, she realized she had done business with someone who had understood her situation before she opened her mouth, and had given her what she needed without requiring her to ask for it. She thought about the conversation for 3 days. She told herself it was because it was unusual. That was not entirely wrong. In the man who had sent her away with what she needed had already turned his attention to the next problem. Anthony Barco was still alive and holding a party, and Roman had just received an invitation. The Barco estate was exactly what the invitation promised, an arrangement of wealth designed to communicate, to every guest who walked through its gates, that the Barcos possessed more of it than they did. Torches lining a gravel path, silk hung over stone archways, servants stationed at intervals holding trays with the slightly too careful posture of people who have been instructed to project abundance. Roman arrived on time, and was neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to make a statement. He moved through the rooms the way he had once moved through enemy territory, reading the distances between people, noting which conversations stopped when he entered and which continued without adjustment. He was polite to everyone and warm with no one, and 3 separate nobles who had come prepared to condescend to the Dmitri heir's infamous reformed idiot left their encounters with him slightly uncertain about what had just happened. Anthony Barco found him an hour into the evening and suggested, through a servant, that Roman might appreciate a private conversation. The private room was upstairs, furnished to project intimacy and control at the same time. Anthony Barco was a man who had built his life around the calculation that most problems, approached from the right angle and with sufficient preparation, could be resolved before they became confrontations. He had the smooth confidence of someone who had never had a plan fail badly enough to update his assessment of himself. He laid out the situation the way a merchant presents a contract whose terms have already been determined. Emily Barco had been wronged, a situation existed that could embarrass certain parties, and Roman might find it useful to consider resolving the Lawrence engagement quietly before the details of a certain evening became broadly known. Roman listened to the entire thing. Then he knocked the papers off the table between them, stood, and told Anthony Barco what he thought of the proposal and the man making it, in terms precise enough to leave no room for charitable interpretation. He walked back downstairs. The party had not paused. The silk still hung over the archways. The servants still moved with their careful posture. Roman accepted a glass he did not intend to drink and rejoined the room, and the expression on his face told the nearest guests nothing at all, which was exactly what he intended. Kevin was near the entrance, doing what Roman had asked him to do for the evening, standing near the servants' area, observing, not drawing attention. He was still new to this kind of work, still learning that usefulness sometimes looked like stillness. He had been managing it adequately until a Barco household knight walked past and, for reasons that appeared to require no specific offense on Kevin's part, struck him across the side of the head with an open hand. The knight continued walking. He said something over his shoulder that the nearest guests politely pretended not to hear. Kevin did not move. He absorbed the impact and kept his position and kept his face neutral, which was the training showing. Roman crossed the room. He struck the knight open-handed exactly once, with enough force to turn the man's head. The room went quiet. He struck him a second time, with the same precision. A third. The knight's legs were uncertain now, and his expression had moved well past surprise into something closer to the beginning of genuine fear. Roman looked at him with no particular anger, just attention, the particular quality of attention someone gives a problem they are assessing, and told him, in front of every guest in the room, that the next time a man in Barco livery touched anything of Roman's, Roman would not use his hand. He walked Kevin out of the party within the hour. On the road back, he thought about the drug, the residue he had found in the original Roman's blood, the way Anthony had referenced a certain evening, as if Roman should already know what evening was meant, the party that the original Roman had attended before he died. The same host, the same pattern, not improvised, rehearsed. The original Roman had been drugged at a previous Barco gathering, and the situation with Emily had been manufactured then, waiting in Anthony's files like a tool. All the blackmail material had been ready before that first party. Anthony Barco had not made an opportunity out of a coincidence. He had created both. The boy who had owned this body had been given a choice between options that were not choices, and he had not known he was being handed a script someone else had written. He had walked into the trap believing it was a room. Roman sat with this for the rest of the ride. Not with grief, exactly. Something cooler and more precise than grief, and far more patient. The Barco Declaration came 2 weeks later. An ancestral debt owed by the Lawrence family, documented in records that Anthony's people had apparently researched with some care. The amount was large. The repayment timeline was immediate. The implicit alternative, military enforcement, was made explicit within 3 days. Roman sent a message to Flora Lawrence. He did not pretend the message was anything other than what it was, a proposal with conditions. He would intervene in the war. He would prevent the Lawrence defeat. In exchange, he needed Flora to publicly claim that Anthony Barco had wronged her, not vaguely, but specifically, in a way that gave Roman legal standing in whatever confrontation followed. He told her exactly what she would be giving up: the flower of Lawrence, the unblemished reputation her family had spent years cultivating, the negotiating position that came with being an eligible noblewoman above reproach. He told her this plainly, without softening it, so the choice was real. Flora read the message. She thought about it for 1 day. She sent her reply. She said yes. Roman received her answer in the morning and began moving the same afternoon. He did not take his full complement of soldiers. The Barco forces were advancing along the main road, holding formation, expecting a conventional defensive line from Lawrence. What they were not expecting was an engagement from their rear, and they had not factored in the possibility that the force hitting them from behind would be led by something that was not a 3-star frontier knight. He came at them in the dark. He moved through the Barco rear camp the way smoke moves through a building, without announcement, touching everything before anyone understood it was there. His shadow techniques had not yet been fully adapted to this body's capabilities, but the gap between what he could currently do and what the Barco rearguard could detect was wide enough. He took their communication lines first, then their supply wagons, then the officers who would have coordinated a response. The thing the Barcos had brought to destroy Lawrence's walls was called a flare, a magical artillery weapon, circle-constructed, designed to punch through fortifications from range. It was the centerpiece of the offensive, the piece of equipment that made the rest of the war possible, and it was positioned in the rear of the formation where it would be safest. Roman stood 30 meters from it and watched it for a moment. He understood what it was doing, mechanically. He understood the circle structure supporting it, the way the mana was being fed through the design and released directionally. He had never studied circle magic in any formal sense. He did not need to. Understanding a power system's mechanism was what he did. He moved in and dismantled the crew maintaining it in under a minute, then broke the structure of the weapon itself at its core joint, the place where the circle's internal flow met the release mechanism, with a strike concentrated through the upper Danchan point at his brain. The flare came apart without exploding, which was the intended outcome. An explosion would have killed the wrong people. Lawrence's walls, which had been taking damage, stopped taking damage. The Barco formation, which had been advancing with confidence, stopped advancing with confidence. Roman located the main engagement point and arrived at the rear of the Barco forces from a direction they had not thought to guard. The war ended inside 48 hours. In the aftermath, with Lawrence territory intact and the Barco force broken, Anthony Barco agreed to the only resolution remaining to him: the Warriors' Battle. 3 fighters from each side, in formal duel format. Whatever outcome the swords produced would be legally binding. Chris went first. He was the vice-captain of the Dmitri Knights. Proud, technically excellent. The kind of fighter who had spent years at a level that felt like a ceiling until Roman showed him the floor had been in the wrong place the whole time. He entered against a Barco 3-star knight with the composure of someone who had worked hard enough to have earned it, and he won with a controlled precision that spoke of recent, serious improvement. The second duel put Roman in the center of the courtyard against Homeros, rank 49 on the continental list, and a 4-star knight who had fought in wars Roman's father had not yet been born for. Homeros entered with measured confidence. He was a professional fighter with decades of experience. and he read the young man across from him the way professionals read young opponents. He expected some ability, expected some bravado, expected the kind of overreach that experience knows how to punish. He set his aura, established his distance, and moved. Roman used the first movement of the heavenly demon sword art. One strike, not held back, not measured for the audience, not shaped to impress anyone. The technique released through the body's current pathways at the precise angle and the precise depth the situation called for, and Homeros, rank 49, 4-star, a continental-level fighter, was on the ground before the audience understood they had seen something happen. He was still alive. Roman had not misjudged the output, but he lay in the dirt of the courtyard with his aura completely collapsed and the particular expression of a man who has just encountered a frame of reference he was not equipped for. The audience was very quiet. The third duel came down to Kevin. He had not been the strongest choice on paper, and everyone present knew it. He was young. He was newly trained. The Barco third fighter was older and heavier, and had a combat record that Kevin's could not yet approach. Kevin entered the space with his characteristic quietness. Not calm, not confidence, just stillness. And the fight began. What happened in the first 30 seconds reset everyone's expectations. Kevin did not fight like someone applying recently learned technique. He fought like someone who had made a decision about how far he was willing to go that his opponent had not made, and who was drawing on whatever reservoir that decision opened. The heavenly demon training had done something to him that was difficult to articulate in conventional terms. He took a strike across the ribs that would have slowed most fighters. He continued moving as if the ribs were a problem he would address later. He pressed until the geometry of the fight collapsed to a single point, and at that point he struck. The courtyard floor cracked in an X-shaped pattern from the force of impact. Kevin stood over the fallen fighter with blood on his collar, and his breathing elevated, and an expression that was not quite present, somewhere further along a spectrum than the courtyard had expected to encounter. The Barco side had no further challenges to offer. 2 weeks later, at a meeting of nobles convened to ratify the resolution of the Lawrence-Barco conflict, Roman looked across the room at Anthony Barco. Anthony had spent the intervening days constructing a composure that was not quite adequate to the weight it was being asked to carry. He was pale in the way that people are pale when they have spent too many nights understanding that something is coming and cannot stop it from coming. The formal agreement included a provision for a trial duel. Roman had ensured it. Anthony made one attempt at an appeal before the exchange began. He cited their shared social circle. He cited the complexity of the original situation. He was still speaking when Roman moved. The duel lasted 4 seconds. The blade went through Anthony Barco's stomach. He sat down on the floor of the meeting hall with the expression of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, and the appeal he had been making died somewhere in the middle of a sentence. Viscount Barco watched this happen from 12 feet away and could not do anything about it. He fled the hall. He fled the city. He was found dead on a hillside 2 days later, his fortune dissolved and his family's holdings in the process of being absorbed by creditors. No one at the meeting hall had followed him. He had simply kept going until there was nowhere left to go. The Barco family was finished. Roman rode back to Dmitri territory in the early afternoon with Kevin riding beside him, and Hans 3 lengths back managing the supply cart with the focused anxiety of a man who has just survived several consecutive events he found deeply alarming. Kevin had said almost nothing since the Warriors' battle. He was still processing something, the threshold he had crossed, or the distance between who he had been 2 months ago and what he had discovered he could become. He would find his footing. Roman was not concerned. He was thinking, instead, about the mine. The Dmitri family's wealth came from iron, and the iron came from the northeast mountain mines, and the mines had been running with the comfortable inefficiency of operations that had not been seriously reviewed in a generation. He had read the production figures on his first week back. He had read them again. The gap between what those mines should be producing and what they currently were was large enough to fund several wars, and closing it required neither magic nor extraordinary resources. It required someone who understood the substrate. He was, after all, a blacksmith's son, and he was about to find out whether the forge remembered him. The mines were a 2-hour ride into the northeast mountains, and Roman made the trip on a gray morning with Hans riding behind him and the particular kind of silence between them that had become, in the past months, something close to comfortable. Hans had stopped assuming he knew what Roman was going to do. Roman had stopped explaining before he did it. The arrangement suited them both. What he found at the mine was 3 generations of reasonable decisions that had accumulated into an unreasonable outcome. The shaft angles were conservative, well-engineered for safety, poorly suited for volume. The extraction patterns followed an old survey that had not been updated when new seams opened. The support structure relied on distribution methods that created unnecessary dead zones, and those dead zones were the primary source of the cave-in events that had been killing workers at a rate everyone had silently accepted as the cost of doing business in the Northeast. He spent 4 days underground. He ate with the workers in the shaft, sitting on the same stone ledges and tearing bread from the same flat loaves. He asked questions that were not managerial, not, "What are your numbers?" but "What does this wall do when the weather changes? How does the vibration travel here versus there? What does it feel like in the hour before a collapse?" The workers answered with the careful precision of people who have developed expert knowledge through proximity to its consequences, and who are not often asked to share it by someone who will actually listen. On the 5th day, he brought a proposal to Romero: artifact installation at 4 specific points in the main shaft, reconfiguring the support flow, and allowing the dead zones to be accessed. The cost was manageable. The projected output increase was 30%, minimum. Romero reviewed the numbers. He looked at his son. He approved it. The 30% materialized within 6 weeks. The cave-in rate dropped to 0 inside the same period. Word moved through the Northeast the way word moves when something that was accepted as permanent turns out not to be. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. What moved faster was the sword. Hendrik had been the Dmitri family's master blacksmith for longer than Roman had been alive. He was a compact, weathered man who held opinions about his craft with the tenacity of someone who had spent decades being right and expected the streak to continue. When Roman asked for access to the forge, Hendrik allowed it with the particular courtesy of an expert granting a request he intends to use as evidence of something. He leaned against the doorframe and watched. Roman took the raw material Hendrik had set out, iron from the northeast seam, specific alloy ratios he had specified, and began. He worked slowly. He did not rush the heating, did not rush the folding, did not perform competence for the audience behind him. He had not stood at a forge since his previous life, but the relationship between his hands and metal was older than memory, and it came back not as skill consciously recalled, but as a physical certainty, the way a language learned young returns in the mouth without needing to pass through thought. He folded the metal 7 times. He maintained the heat at the precise temperature the specific iron required, lower than Hendrik expected, held longer than the standard approach, producing a crystalline structure in the blade that was not possible through conventional timing. He shaped the edge with a patience that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with knowing exactly where he was going. When he quenched the blade and lifted it, the sword caught the forge light along its length in a way that had nothing to do with surface polish. Hendrik stepped away from the doorframe. He crossed the room and took the sword from Roman's hands and examined it for a long time without speaking. He ran his thumb along the edge with the focus of someone reading a text they had not expected to encounter. He checked the balance. He checked the internal structure where the folding had produced patterns that did not match anything his own methods produced. He handed it back. He said nothing immediately, because he was a man who had learned not to speak before he was finished thinking. What he eventually said was that Roman could use the forge whenever he needed it, and that if Roman had specific requirements for materials, he should tell Hendrik directly, rather than working with the standard inventory. He said it the way someone concedes a position they were wrong to hold. The sword was named Salamander, after the territory it had been born in. It was the first thing Roman had made in this world that was entirely his own, and he carried it with the unceremonious attention of someone who treats important things as tools rather than symbols. The fencing competition arrived shortly after, arranged by the Northeast nobility, as the kind of social event that was also an assessment. The regional lords and their heirs attended with the dual purpose of maintaining alliances and determining, at greater resolution than gossip allowed, exactly what had happened to the Dmitri heir and how much of the story was real. Roman competed. He did not lose a match. He did not need to dazzle anyone. The gap between his capability and the competition's was wide enough that the results spoke without embellishment, and embellishment would have been a form of dishonesty he found inefficient. Willis arrived 3 days after the competition concluded. He was a ranking official from the Valhalla Temple, the continental body that maintained the list of the 100 named fighters. His job was to evaluate combatants who had demonstrated results at a certain threshold and assign them an official ranking. The death of Homeros, rank 49, required investigation at the minimum. A rank assignment at the conclusion would be standard procedure. He brought a measurement device. It broke. The device was calibrated for the upper range of current ranked fighters, up to 6-star, with sufficient margin that it should not have been stressed by whatever a reformed frontier noble's son could produce. Roman channeled through the instrument at perhaps a quarter of his current output, keeping the Danshan circulation controlled and the upper center muted entirely, and the device produced a crack along its crystal housing and refused further cooperation. Willis looked at the device. He looked at Roman. He classified Roman at 3-star, wrote it into the official documentation, and assigned him rank 100, the bottom of the list, the entry point. He noted in his report that the measurement device had malfunctioned. He did not note his personal conclusions, because putting certain things in writing required a confidence he had not yet assembled. Roman accepted rank 100 with the equanimity of someone who understands that a number on a list is a resource, not a verdict. He was the youngest ranked individual in Cairo's recorded history. He was also the only person on the continental list whose official classification was separated from his actual ability by a distance large enough to park an army in. This was exactly what he wanted. The continent would calibrate its expectations to the number. The number would be wrong. Romero heard the news that evening and came to find Roman at the training ground, which was unusual. He was a man who communicated through delegation and paperwork rather than direct visits, and the fact of his presence in the yard carried its own weight before he said anything. He stood for a moment and watched Roman working through a movement sequence at half speed, the third movement of the heavenly demon sword art, something this world had no framework to identify. He told Roman that he did not know what path his son was walking. He said he did not need to know. He said that whatever road it was, Roman would not walk it without a father standing beside him. He said it plainly, without dramatics, and then went back inside. Roman stood in the yard after he left and held the moment at arm's length, the way he held most things that threatened to become more than information. It did not resolve into anything clean. The heavenly demon who had survived a childhood survival pit by closing the part of himself that wanted a father found, unexpectedly, that closing it again was not as simple as it had once been. Something in this body's history, or perhaps something in Roman Dmitri's original hunger for a father's approval, had gotten into the soil of his new life. He could not locate exactly where. He let the moment pass and returned to his work, and the thing that had moved in him settled quietly and did not entirely leave. The open recruitment followed 2 weeks later. 500 applicants came to Dmitri territory from across the Northeast and beyond, drawn by a combination of the stories that had been circulating since the Lawrence Barco War and the specific terms Roman had posted. Open entry, no prior rank required, merit determining everything. The noble sons who showed up expecting preferential placement found the intake process indifferent to their names. The arrow test came first, not target shooting, an arrow released toward the applicant, who was expected to avoid it. Roman had calibrated the release arc so that a person paying attention could move in time, but a person performing attention instead of having it could not. The field narrowed by half. The personal dual assessment brought it down further. Roman faced each remaining candidate himself, briefly, looking for specific things, whether they could read a situation when their initial approach failed, whether the gap between what they planned and what actually happened broke them or adjusted them. He was not looking for the strongest people. He was looking for the most useful ones. He identified Lucas on the third day. Lucas was a rank B mercenary who had worked contracts in 4 kingdoms and who had the particular economy of movement of someone who has spent years in situations where being efficient was the difference between coming home and not. In the personal assessment duel, he did not attempt to outskill Roman. He threw sand in Roman's eyes. It did not work. Roman tracked the sand before it landed and stepped clear, but the attempt itself was the relevant information. It showed a mind that assessed the problem honestly and used every available resource, without the pride that made most fighters refuse tools that felt beneath them. Roman assigned Lucas the intelligence role before the duel was formally concluded. He also identified Henderson on that same day, which was less immediately obvious. Henderson was a former farmer from the eastern border of Dmitri territory. large-framed, slower than most of the other applicants, with basic technique that had been learned recently, rather than built over years. He passed the arrow test barely. He held his own in the dual assessment by absorbing damage with a stubbornness that outlasted his opponent's willingness to continue delivering it. By every conventional metric, he was not the strongest candidate in the pool. Roman watched him pick himself up from the ground for the fourth time in the assessment and keep moving, and marked him in the roster with a notation he did not explain to anyone. The 30 soldiers were selected, and training began. What Roman asked of them was not what they expected, and what they expected varied by background, but all their expectations shared one feature. They assumed the heavenly demon martial arts would be adapted for them gradually, at a pace that corresponded to conventional progression. Roman taught Kevin the body's internal structure first, then took that understanding and used it to teach Chris a specific refinement to his aura circulation that produced immediate, measurable results. He used Kevin as a training target for Chris, which Kevin found useful and Chris found uncomfortably educational. He taught Henderson separately, with a patience that had nothing performative in it, the patience of someone who understands that a person developing slowly is not developing poorly. Henderson began to improve, slowly, but in a direction that did not stop. The conscription notice arrived in the 5th month, as expected. Roman was required to serve a mandatory posting at the Southern Front. 6 months of military service, the standard obligation for a noble heir of his age and rank. He went without protest, with Chris and Kevin and Henderson and the rest of the 30, and arrived at a posting that turned out to be approximately what Mackin had warned him about before he left Cairo, a comfortable arrangement where noble sons avoided real war and career officers tried to manage their frustration. The Southern Front was positioned against the Kingdom of Hector, which had been technically hostile for decades without committing to anything. The posting had evolved, through years of non-events, into something closer to a supervised retreat than a military position. The noble sons played cards. Their servants managed their laundry. The training schedules were advisory. Mac Burney ran the Southern training camp with the precise dissatisfaction of a one-armed veteran commander who has been given an assignment below what he is capable of and who cannot do anything about it except maintain standards for the people who will listen. He was watching Roman's unit drill on the 2nd day when he registered that what he was seeing was not standard cavalry formation work, and came over to take a closer look, and found 30 soldiers operating at a level of coordination and individual competence that had no business being at a Southern non-event posting. He kept watching for 20 minutes and said nothing. Then he went back to his command tent and his dissatisfaction, which had changed its shape slightly. Roman trained his people every morning. The other units watched for the first week, then stopped watching because watching made them uncomfortable. Henderson gained 2 kilograms of muscle in the 1st month. Kevin began working on the advanced night techniques without being asked. Chris challenged Roman to a sparring session every 3 days with a consistency that suggested he had established it as a private project. The invasion came on the 43rd day. It announced itself first in the communication system, reports coming in from the eastern observation posts, with a frequency and urgency that did not match the standard pattern of border incidents. Roman read the first 3 dispatches and understood the shape of what was happening before the Southern Front's senior command had finished their emergency meeting. Hector was moving, and moving seriously, and the primary target was not the defensive line. The defensive line was noise. The Weaver portal in the rear camp was the objective, the teleportation infrastructure that connected the Southern Front to Cairo's interior. If Hector took the portal, they could push forces directly behind Cairo's defensive structure and the entire strategic picture inverted. The senior nobles commanding the Southern Front reached this conclusion approximately 4 hours after Roman did. By the time they were issuing orders to fall back and consolidate, Roman had already moved his unit to the 5th defensive line, which was the furthest forward position and the one every rational actor was currently abandoning. Baron Bruce was there when Roman arrived, a corrupt officer who had spent his posting extorting local supply chains and who had managed, in the first hours of the invasion, to confirm his cowardice was proportional to his corruption by giving desertion orders to the soldiers under his command. He was in the process of leaving when Roman found him, dressed for travel, with a horse already saddled. Roman ended the conversation quickly and assumed command of the 5th line. The Hector advance came within the hour. A probing force, then the main body, probing the line that should have collapsed, and finding instead something that refused to move in the expected way. Romans 30 held the position for 6 hours. They did not hold it conventionally. They held it the way 30 soldiers trained by the heavenly demon hold a position, which involved considerably more night movement, misdirection, and precision targeting of coordination points than the Hector commanders had planned for. McBurney arrived at the 5th line at dusk with 200 soldiers from the training camp, because someone had sent him a message telling him where the actual fighting was happening. He looked at the position, and the men holding it, and the casualties they had inflicted on the forces pressing them, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he deployed his people and took the flank Roman left him. The Hector advance slowed. It did not stop. The other defensive lines were falling in sequence. Roman could see the signal lights from the 5th position, and the mathematics of the situation were clear. A slowed advance was not a stopped one, and time was Hector's advantage. Roman pulled his unit back into the mountain range to the east on the 3rd night, not in retreat, but in transition, because the terrain in the mountains offered something the open line did not. He had spent his previous life developing shadow arts in ranges that made these mountains feel modest. The Hector forces that followed him into the high ground did so with the confidence of a pursuing army that outnumbers its target significantly. They discovered, over the next 3 days, that confidence of that specific variety had a cost. Roman moved through the mountain fog at night and was not detectable by aura sense. His internal circulation was refined enough to produce almost no ambient signature, and his shadow techniques in this body were already sufficient to make him effectively invisible to conventional tracking. He hit supply lines, then communication posts, then the officers who were coordinating the pursuit, and then he hit them again in a different order, and the Hector forces pressing into the mountains discovered that their casualty rate bore no relationship to their number or their organizational coherence. He captured a communication device from a Hector officer on the 4th night and used it to speak to Edwin Hector directly. He told the prince what he thought of the Southern Front invasion. He told him what he thought of the Kronos coordination that had made it possible. He told him these things in the calm voice of someone providing information to a person who will be made to understand its full implications eventually. And in the background while he spoke, there were sounds that the prince would have recognized as interrogation. Edwin Hector listened to the whole transmission without responding. In the morning, Roman abandoned the communication device and moved deeper into the range. He was preparing something, and it required a full night, and at the end of it he would need to be somewhere the Hector force was not expecting him to be. He sat in a mountain cave above the fog line and ran the fight with Edwin's mage and 5-star knight butler through his mind for the 4th consecutive hour. He had engaged them directly on the 3rd day, a calculated probe to assess what he was genuinely facing, and had retreated with blood in his mouth and a very clear accounting of what Butler's technique did at its 3rd movement, and what the War Mage's circle construction looked like in the 2nd phase. He had not been ready then. He was building ready. The other defensive lines had all fallen now. That meant the original strategic structure was gone, and what remained was a 3-day window before Hector could establish stable communication with Kronos and invite a military coordination that would make the situation genuinely complicated. 3 days was enough. 3 days was, in fact, exactly sufficient for what he intended to do next. He stopped running through the butler fight and sat still for a moment in the dark of the cave. Outside, the mountain was quiet. The Hector forces below had stopped pursuing. They were waiting for him to make a predictable mistake. He was about to propose the opposite of a mistake. He proposed the direct assault at dawn, in a meeting he had requested with the Southern Front's remaining senior command and McBurney. He laid out the situation with the efficiency of someone who has already decided what is going to happen and is offering the others the opportunity to be part of it rather than asking for their permission. The other defensive lines were gone. The Weaver portal was the only remaining strategic asset worth protecting. Hector had 3 days before Kronos contact could be established, and the situation locked into a configuration that benefited no one in Cairo. He said they were going to attack. He did not say he was going to do most of it alone, because some information is more useful after the fact. He left the meeting before the objections finished forming, and was already moving south by the time the senior commanders had begun arguing about whether the plan was possible. McBurney listened to the argument for approximately 4 minutes, then assembled his people and followed. The supply town of Lascaux sat at the junction of 2 roads where the Hector military supply chain met the Kronos coordination infrastructure that had made the invasion possible in the first place. It held approximately 10,000 soldiers, rear echelon troops, supply administrators, Kronos-aligned advisors, and the logistical machinery that kept the invasion's forward edge fed and armed. It was not a fortress. It was a staging ground, which meant it was organized for throughput rather than defense. Roman arrived at the edge of Lascau's perimeter in the hour before dawn, alone. He had spent the night descending from the mountain range at a pace that would not have been sustainable for anyone without a Danchan-trained body, and he had covered ground that the Hector commanders would have said required 2 days. He stood at the tree line and looked at the lights of the camp below, and felt, for a moment, the particular quality of stillness that preceded large decisions. Not hesitation, something more like acknowledgement. The recognition that what he was about to do would cross a threshold that certain other things had not. He drew on the orb of demonic fire's early precursor, the fire techniques he had been developing through the second bodily reform, the infernal divine art that made flame not an external force but an internal state. He had been building toward this since the dwarves' material had first unlocked the pathway, and what he had was not the full realized technique. It was enough. He moved into the camp from the northern side and he brought the fire with him. What happened in Lascau over the next 3 hours was not a battle. A battle requires 2 sides capable of sustained engagement. What Roman produced in Lascau was a systematic elimination of an encamped force that did not have the capability to respond to what was doing the eliminating. He moved through the camp with the fire running through him like a second circulatory system, and wherever he directed it, the result was final, and the Kronos-aligned soldiers who understood they were under attack by something could not determine where the something was coming from in time to organize any response that mattered. The sun was coming up when he walked out of the southern side of what had been Lascau. The supply town was not a supply town anymore. He kept moving. Over the next 2 days, he took 3 Kronos Eastern outposts in sequence, frontier military installations that the Kronos command had considered safely behind their engagement line. The Gordas teleportation portal was the 4th objective and the most important. It was a Weaver portal, the kind of fixed teleportation infrastructure that militaries spent enormous resources controlling, and it connected Kronos' eastern holdings to their main force positions. Whoever held Gordas controlled who could go where and when. The garrison at Gordas was larger than the outposts. Roman went through it anyway, because the variable that changes the equation at Gordas was not the garrison size. It was what you could do with the portal once the garrison was no longer an obstacle. He held the portal. He sent word to Mac Burney and the Dmitri soldiers at the surviving Weaver position on Cairo's side. The message was specific and the timeline was narrow, and Mac Burney read it, passed it to his senior officers, and gave the order to move, before he had formally decided he agreed with the plan. The Dmitri forces portal jumped to behind Kronos' main line. General Vamford commanded the Kronos force, a professional soldier with a 300,000-man army and the confidence of someone whose numbers had always previously been adequate. He discovered the forces behind him at approximately the same moment he received reports that the supply chain had stopped functioning and the Gordas portal was transmitting Cairo soldiers into his rear. He was a skilled commander and his response was technically correct. Reallocate, consolidate, create interior lines. And it did not matter, because the position was already broken. An army cut off from supply with hostile forces behind it, and an intact Cairo line in front of it, is not an army with options. It is an army with time left. Vamford's 300,000 were trapped. Roman found Butler before Butler found him. The 5-star knight was Edwin Hector's primary military instrument, a blade in human form, technical and cold, with the kind of aura density that put him at a level where most fighters on the continent would think carefully before engaging. He had won the cave encounter 3 days earlier by a margin of approximately 4 seconds of Roman pressing an attack that his current body's recovery could not sustain. Roman had spent the intervening time inside that 4-second gap, examining it from every angle. He came at Butler directly. The duel did not run long, but it was not clean. Butler was precisely as capable as Roman's previous assessment had indicated, and what had changed was not Butler's capability, but Roman's approach. He did not give the 5-star knight the space to set his aura properly, pressing from the instant of contact, keeping the fight at a pace and a distance that nullified the advantage of Butler's superior conventional output. The heavenly demon sword art did not require space to wind up. It was a system built for closeness, for finding the gap inside a guard that looked like it had no gaps. The third movement caught Butler across the guard arm. The follow-through dropped him. Roman stood over Butler with his sword at the man's throat and the decision in his hands. Edwin Hector walked out of the command tent. It was not what generals did. They did not walk personally into their knight's dueling ground at the moment of their knight's defeat, because that was not a position that preserved authority or projected control. Edwin walked out anyway, and he did not carry a weapon, and his face had an expression that Roman recognized from the category of things that happen to proud people when something they cared about is being lost and they cannot prevent it. He was not asking for Butler's life as a negotiation. He was asking for it because it mattered to him, and he had chosen to let that show. Roman took the sword back. He looked at Edwin Hector for a long moment. The prince was younger than the campaign he had run suggested, a man who had designed a geopolitically sophisticated military operation in coordination with a continental empire, who had nearly succeeded, and who was standing in the dirt of his defeat, without any of the postures that defeat usually produced in men of his position. He was simply present. He was simply himself. Roman said the gate was open. Cairo's forces came through in the next 3 hours. The remaining Hector knights fell in a series of engagements that Roman directed from the front, and the war that had begun with an invasion of the southern front ended with the Hector military apparatus in Cairo dissolved, and Vamford's 300,000 formally surrendered to an arrangement that Cairo had not expected to be in a position to dictate. Edwin Hector requested a meeting with Roman 3 days after the conclusion. He arrived alone, which was either brave or calculated or both, and he made an offer that he had apparently spent the intervening days deciding was worth the cost. He would swear vassal loyalty to Dmitri. He would place his capabilities, strategic, magical, military, in service of whatever Roman was building. In exchange, he asked for one thing, the theory of the upper dantian, not the technique in full, the theory. The architectural principle that Roman had been teaching his soldiers and that Edwin had watched at work across the length of a campaign and understood, with the precision of an exceptional strategic mind, was the foundation of something that made the existing continental combat framework obsolete. Roman considered him. He said yes. The rank battles began within a week of Roman's return to Cairo. He went through the list from the bottom, not quickly in the sense of rushing, carefully, thoughtfully, giving each ranked fighter the respect of a genuine encounter, but at a pace that the Cairo ranking community found somewhere between unprecedented and unsettling. He took rank 99 on a Thursday morning. He took rank 87 the same afternoon. The fighters ranked in the 70s and 60s put up progressively more resistance and were progressively defeated by a margin that did not shrink the way the resistance increased. By rank 45, the remaining ranked fighters were watching his progress through the list, the way water watches a stone falling toward it. He reached Count Nicholas in under 2 weeks. Nicholas was Cairo's strongest fighter and had been for 11 years, a 5-star swordsman with the kind of settled authority that comes from a long time at the top of a local hierarchy. He fought Roman in a public square with perhaps 300 witnesses, and he fought him well, with everything he had, and he held the exchange for 4 minutes, which was longer than anyone before him in the rank battles had managed. He was on the ground at the end of those 4 minutes with the specific expression of a man who has just discovered the scale of the gap between what he was and what stood in front of him. Roman helped him up. He was rank 1 of Cairo. He went to the palace the same evening. Benedict was the leader of the aristocratic faction that had, for many years, constituted the actual governing power of Cairo, under King Daniel's formal authority. He was a careful man with a sophisticated understanding of how power moved through a political system, and his understanding of what Roman's rank 1 represented was accurate enough that he had already assembled soldiers outside the palace before Roman arrived. Perhaps 400 men, positioned at the main approaches. A message without words. Roman looked at the soldiers. He looked at Benedict, who stood behind them with the expression of someone who has placed a bet he is no longer sure about. He walked into them. What followed moved through the streets of Cairo for approximately 2 hours, and at the end of it, Benedict had fewer soldiers than he had started with, and Roman had not stopped walking. The Phoenix Tower's mages, whom Roman had coordinated with in advance, removed the walls of Benedict's secondary position with a precision that suggested they had been looking for a reason to demonstrate their capabilities. The Gregory and Denver factions, the other 2 major political blocs that had been treating Cairo as their shared inheritance, collapsed the same day through a combination of Romans' forces at their gates and the sudden vivid understanding that the faction structure itself was being eliminated rather than negotiated with. Benedict was found in a cave below his estate. He had apparently been in the cave for 8 hours when Roman soldiers reached him. He emerged from it into the light of the city that had treated him as its informal ruler for a decade, and he was walked through the streets to the central square, and there he was executed in the manner of someone who had abused public authority, which was publicly. The four-faction structure of Cairo collapsed in a single day. Roman had a meeting with King Daniel the following morning. He presented the proposal clearly. The factions that had been extracting Cairo's resources for a generation were gone. The political landscape had been reset. In exchange for the work of resetting it, Roman requested a duchy, formal political authority over a territory that could function as a base for something larger than a baronetcy. He said what that something larger would be, and he said it the way someone describes a plan they have already begun, rather than a plan they are proposing. King Daniel looked at him across the council table. He granted it. The Duchy of Dmitri was declared on a morning in early spring, and the proclamation was read in a city that had not been ready for it and had no framework to resist it. Roman Dmitri heard the news at the mine, where he had been overseeing a new shaft survey, and sat down on a supply crate and said nothing for several minutes. Hendrik heard it at the forge and immediately began planning what sword should be made to mark the occasion. Hans heard it while managing Roman's correspondence in the manor office and set down the letter he was drafting and sat still for a moment and then picked it up again and kept writing, because there was a great deal to do and the work was not going to stop on account of history. The Kronos Empire issued its response 3 weeks later. It was formal and it was direct, a Roman Dmitri, acting outside his authority and in violation of established continental military conventions, had killed Kronos personnel, destroyed Kronos infrastructure, and participated in the defeat of Kronos military assets coordinated with the Hector campaign. The appropriate compensation was the surrender of Roman's right arm, the sword arm, specifically, to be removed and delivered to the Kronos military attaché in Cairo by a date 30 days hence. The demand arrived on a Tuesday morning. Roman read it. He set it on the desk. He told Hans to reply that the compensation was declined. He said to write it in plain language without diplomatic softening, because the purpose of the reply was not to manage Kronos's feelings, but to make the position clear. Hans wrote it. He sealed it with the Dmitri mark. He delivered it to the Kronos attaché with the expression of a man who has made peace with whatever is about to happen next. Count Fabius arrived at the Dmitri estate the following week, the man Cairo's political class called the Raccoon for his talent at surviving every change of power with his position intact. He was a survivor of the faction era who had read the new landscape more accurately than most, and who had arrived at the conclusion that the most useful thing he could do with his considerable experience was place it in service of the person who had just restructured the continent's most dysfunctional kingdom in a single day. He offered himself as an emissary to Kronos. He said he understood the risk. He said he wanted to go. Roman looked at him for a long moment with the assessment he gave everyone, and found someone who was precisely what he said he was, a political animal who had chosen, for reasons that reflected either courage or extremely accurate calculation, or both, to make this his stake in what was coming. He accepted the offer. He did not tell Fabius that if Kronos detained him, he would go to Kronos himself and collect him. He did not need to say it. He simply told him to go and to come back, and Fabius heard something in those words that a man going into enemy territory needed to hear. The swordsmanship exhibition was 3 months away. Roman had been thinking about it since before the duchy was declared, not as a performance, not as a demonstration of personal capability, but as an act of structural revision. The continent's entire martial tradition was built on a flawed imitation of a system he had known since childhood, and the flawed version was limiting everyone who practiced it. Making the Danchan theory public was not generosity. It was the same logic that governed everything he did. The position he was building required people around him who were as capable as they could be made, and they could not become that inside a framework that had a false ceiling baked into its foundations. He was going to remove the false ceiling. What the continent would do with that information was its own business. What the Kronos Empire, built on the martial tradition of a man who had constructed aura from imperfect memories of something Roman knew perfectly, would do with the revelation that their entire military foundation was someone's reconstruction from incomplete knowledge, was also its own business. Roman suspected Kronos' business was about to become considerably more complicated. He was teaching Kevin the divine soul technique the morning the first Kronos assassin arrived. The assassin was professional, which meant the attempt was better than Roman expected it to be, which meant he had mildly underestimated how seriously Kronos was taking the arm refusal. He dealt with the attempt quickly. He sent the assassin back to Kronos in a condition that conveyed the return was deliberate rather than the result of failure on the assassin's part. And 2 days later, 3 more arrived. Different style, darker technique, the kind of shadow magic-enhanced movement that had a demonic tinge Roman recognized from older studies. He dealt with those as well, with somewhat more interest in the technique they were using, because the dark magic structure was a thread worth pulling on. Someone had given Kronos access to something that did not belong to the conventional martial or magical traditions of this world. He found the demonic core logic in the technique and dismantled the attack through it, and afterward he sat for a while thinking about who in this world would have access to demonic realm power and why. The question had an answer somewhere. He could feel it the way a practitioner feels an incomplete form, the shape of something that should resolve but has not yet found its final position. He set it aside for now. There was the exhibition to prepare, and there was Kevin's training, and there was a Kronos intelligence network inside Dmitri territory that Lucas had just identified and was in the process of quietly mapping before elimination. There was always more to do. He was forging the sword he intended to call Disaster when Hans knocked on the forge door with the specific quality of knock that meant something had arrived that required attention before the forging was finished. Roman set the blade down at a stable point in the process and opened the door, and Hans gave him the letter. It was an invitation from Valhalla, the Southern Empire, the most powerful military force on the continent, host of the continental ranking system. An invitation to the Valhalla Festival, the great martial gathering that the Empire held once every several years. The letter was cordial, the letter was elegant, the letter was, Roman understood within 2 lines of reading it, a trap constructed with considerable care by people who had been watching his rise with the kind of attention that precedes a specific kind of response. He looked at the invitation for a moment. He told Hans to accept. Hans absorbed this with the silence of someone adding an item to a mental list that had been growing for several months. He took the letter back. He went to draft the acceptance. Roman returned to the forge and picked up Disaster where he had left it, and the blade caught the fire's light as he raised it, and somewhere in the reflection he could see the shape of everything that was coming. The Valhalla trap, the Kronos War, the thing with the dark magic and the continental foundations built on a transmigrated man's imperfect memory, and beyond all of it, something enormous and ancient that had not yet announced itself clearly, but that left traces in the things he had been finding. The continent thought it was watching a frontier duke's son accumulate power for regional dominance. The continent was looking at the wrong scale entirely. He struck the blade, and the ring of the hammer filled the forge, and the fire answered.